If you're curious about the science behind manifesting and why it's not just about thinking positive thoughts, understanding the neuroscience behind spirituality and your brain, and how to feel and get unstuck no matter where you are, then today's episode is for you. Welcome back to a Sharper Life podcast. I'm your host, Nikki Sharp. Each week, we dive into the root causes of self-sabotage and habits to help you identify and overcome conscious and subconscious fears to create the life you want. Today, I have an incredible guest and one of the world's leading neuroscientists. Dr. Dhru Swart is a medical doctor, senior lecturer at MIT Sloan, the best-selling author of the book, The Source. She has a PhD in neuroscience from King's College London and a medical degree from Oxford University. Dr. Swart is an expert on neuroplasticity and has been featured in Forbes, The Guardian, The New York Times, and has given talks at events such as the World Economic Forum and TEDx. In addition to her work as a neuroscientist, Dr. Swart is a leadership coach and has worked with companies such as Google, Microsoft, and JP Morgan. Tara is the host of the #1 rated life science podcast, Reinvent Yourself with Dr. Tara. Welcome, Tara. It is incredible to have you on A Sharper Life. I want to dive straight in and ask you, what do people get wrong about manifesting?
Well, can I start by saying I wish I had you every morning bigging me up like this, because it's definitely having a very positive effect on my brain. So yeah, that's a really great question. And from a cognitive science point of view, I would say that the idea that it's an external force and that you're not using the agency of the power of your brain, that is an issue in terms of, people really taking the action that they need to manifest things. So it's rather than creating a fantasy, sitting on the couch and waiting for it to come true, it's the fact that you can use your brain to do things that is more likely to make those things happen.
I remember hearing, and I repeat it often to clients, there's a quick story that I'll tell. A man says to God, I want to win the lottery. And the next day says, God, I want to win the lottery. Next day prays, God, I want to win the lottery. After a year, he gets very frustrated and it starts cussing at God. God, why did I not win the lottery? And God, booming voice says, my son, you need to go buy a ticket. And so what I'm hearing you say, and something that I would add to this, I think a lot of people do get wrong about manifesting, is that it's not just the vibration. It's not just thinking about what you want. We have to have action. And I'm curious your thoughts about dealing with the subconscious limiting beliefs and the fears and how those hold us back to actually get you where you want to go.
Yeah, so just to segue on from your story and then get into that, I actually think that manifestation and religious action are not mutually exclusive. So if you pray, that means that every day you're bringing to the front of your mind the things that you really want. So that's, raising from non-conscious to conscious your awareness of what you actually want and helping your brain to focus attention on potential opportunities to, grasp and take advantage of in terms of bringing yourself closer to your goals. And then going back to what you said about the limiting beliefs that might be under your thought process. So basically, we're asking people to take action. To take action, you have to have certain thoughts about what's possible, what you could do, what the options are. And underneath your thought process are your beliefs. I prefer to use the phrase non-conscious than subconscious. So they're not always at the front of your conscious mind. If you dig down, you can probably work out what they are, but most people aren't doing that on a regular basis. So what I suggest is that if you have certain recurring thoughts, whether it's because, you can surface them by writing in your journal, or if you just are aware that you're often thinking things like, that's probably not going to work out for me, or that's the kind of thing that happens to other people, then you can really ask yourself, what must I believe about myself to have that thought? That's the kind of easier way to approach it. And so usually it comes down to something like lack of deserving, low self-worth. And once you've worked that out, you can create a positive affirmation that replaces that thought. So you mentioned neuroplasticity already, and that's the ability of the brain to change at any age, any stage, any mindset. And so you can't undo beliefs or thoughts in your brain, but you can overwrite them with something that becomes a stronger pathway. So every time you think something like, that's not going to work out for me, if you have a phrase like, what's the best possible outcome if I try? And you repeat that every time, then eventually your mindset will be, why not try? And then...
Does it really work though? I mean, I can say from my own life, it has. And I'm someone who, I know that people look at me and my life now and it looks, very wonderful, bougie. And I've worked very hard mindset wise and heart wise to get there. I come from a place of eating disorders. I was a hypochondriac. I had every medicine in my cabinet. I was terrified of everything. I was a control freak of every, aspect. And so I know that this works, but it's different for me to sit there and say, hey, I know you don't feel worthy, but if you say this positive affirmation, it's going to change your life. Are there things that people should know when it comes to, it's not just the affirmation, but what else is holding us back? Because we all have the I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough, I don't feel XYZ enough. So what do you say in regards to, it's clearly not just changing the limiting belief to the affirmation. There must be something more to it.
Well, repetition and emotional intensity, they boost neuroplasticity. So if you do repeat that phrase, when it gets to the point that that phrase, that belief becomes more natural to you than the one that you had before, it does actually change your mindset. But, that could take a long time. You're absolutely right. It's not about creating this affirmation and then feeling you're suddenly the highest self-worth person. So the other thing I would say psychologically is that those phrases, the more non-conscious they are, the longer they've been there. So going back to that period of childhood that's 0 to 7, that can raise a lot of insight into why you might have those thoughts. And what I found really helpful for people is if you can identify that thought and then tell yourself that it's not your thought, it's either the voice of your mother or, a critical caregiver, then it helps you to separate yourself from being, feeling so much like that is you. And another way of putting that is when we are self-critical, I ask people, if your sister or your best friend came to you and said, this is how I'm feeling, what would you say to her? We're much kinder to the people that we love than we are to ourselves. So it's about slowly digging away at those beliefs, from all angles until, and that may involve the help of a therapist or a coach. But depending on the severity of it, journaling may be enough for, you or I or someone. So looking at it from all angles and just slowly building up your self-worth through those things, but also who you surround yourself with. What are people going to say to you when you beat yourself up? If there are people who are going to say, you're amazing, you can do it, look at how many times you've done it before, that's super helpful.
I so appreciate what you just said. And as you're talking, my brain has gone into 5 different questions I want to ask all at once. In terms of this actually just recently happened in my life. I haven't shared this before, but I've been going through a very challenging time in my life and haven't publicly been able to speak about it yet. And those closest in my life, I have really relied on and actually asked for help. And I think this is a really big part of getting what we want. The manifestation is actually identifying, okay, what do you want? But then asking for it. And I had reached out a few weeks ago, I think, to 3 different friends at different times, with saying, I could really use some words of encouragement right now. I'm feeling really, really bad. And they know what was going on. And oh my goodness, the responses that I got were, just as you said at the beginning of the podcast, when someone else speaks of you so highly and reminds you of the power that we all have. So I really appreciate that you say that, because I'm living, breathing proof right now. It's during some of my darkest days, I've used those words of others to help remind me of the things that I've done. But you also just talked about that our beliefs are not necessarily our beliefs. And I want to go into that, because something that I just learned in therapy through my own healing journey and what I'm going through now, my therapist said, Nikki, your guilt is not yours. Your guilt is that of your parents because of their own trauma they were going through when they had me, their divorce, and that guilt was actually passed on. So I'm experiencing secondary guilt that's not mine, but it feels like mine. So she reminded me, this is not yours anytime it comes up. So I'd love to dive into understanding our beliefs and where they come from, how they affect us, and how we can change them.
Wow, there's a lot.
There's a lot. I know.
So the first thing I'd like to say from your personal story is that the ability to ask for help is a real sign of maturity, because what tends to happen on that neuroplasticity journey is that we start off by feeling like, if I have to ask for help, that must mean that I'm weak. And so that will drive people to not be good at asking for help. I've been on that journey myself. And one of the things I'm proud of saying now is I am good at asking for help when I need it. And I still have, when I go to do that, I still have a bit of a issue that, that's associated with weakness, but I have learned and, overwritten that pathway to the point that I will ask for the help, even if I have a bit of a, trouble starting. I think what you said about guilt coming from your parents is, there's two things here. So one is the things that we can go back in our memory and uncover that we were conscious of at the time, and we can understand why that's making us think in certain ways now. There's also sort of less explicit things. So anything from the stress that your mother might have been going through when she was pregnant with you. So if we think about the fact that you'd shared a blood supply, if your mother was stressed and had high circulating levels of cortisol, then that would have gone through the placenta and gone through, the blood supply of tiny little baby. So that can do things like make you more anxious. It can potentially make you more resilient as well. Now, if the message here is absolutely not to make mums feel guilty if they had a stressful pregnancy, it's about the fact that, one generation ago, your mum may not have had the skills or the knowledge to think, I was highly stressed during the pregnancy, let me do everything I can to calm this baby's nervous system. But if you do know that you were stressed and you understand that there are things you can do to comfort your child, reassure your child, make them feel safe, then you can make up for that, which is, the great thing about neuroplasticity. But there's another thing as well, which is you're talking about the fact that that your parents had, some stress and guilt, and that would have had an effect on you. But research into epigenetics, which is about the fact that your gene expression is affected by your environment. So we used to think, DNA was everything and that could never change. But we understand now that certain genes get switched on or off depending on, things that happen. Let's start with back in pregnancy, but also in previous generations. So examples of that are the Holocaust and the Dutch famine. They've been researched the most. Obviously, there are other examples of communities that have been put through stress. So it's so complicated. So it could basically be coming from your grandparents or before. It could be coming from physically the environment that you were in as soon as you were conceived, and then obviously the environment that you were in as a young child. And we've focused on, back in the past and the very early days, but there are people who have perfectly pleasant, not stressful childhoods, but may for one reason or another get into a toxic relationship. And then, that can affect your neuroplasticity, because that can make you feel small and, not shine your light and kind of have low boundaries for what you tolerate. So it's kind of like your whole life's work.
In terms of, so you mentioned the 0 to 7, and please correct me if I'm wrong here or expand on it, but the 0 to 7, what I've understood is that that's really where our sense of ego, the I identity is formed, but also a lot of our beliefs that get rooted into that subconscious mind. And maybe you can talk a little bit about what the conscious, subconscious, or unconscious is. But let's say someone did have a harder childhood for whatever reason, and it could have been, and we'll get to this, of big T, little t trauma. So either something really bad happened or just something small, wasn't a major thing, but it affected you. How does someone like me, who did experience actually quite a lot of trauma, and I've been diagnosed with complex PTSD, yay, thanks, which has been a blessing and a curse, but how does someone who has had that childhood, or even, the hard relationship, how do they deal with it now when it was something from before you even knew what you were necessarily thinking?
So let's just start by clarifying what you said. So what's conscious and what's subconscious or non-conscious is simply what you're aware of, what you actually know. So with something like a recent divorce, you know that you are going through a stressful time and you know what's going on in that relationship. Things that happened from 0 to 7 and even 7 to 14, we may not recall, or we may not have been consciously aware of at the time. Or we may have been aware of but not understood the implications and consequences on our mental health later in life, our choice of partner later in life. So there's a few ways you can do this. You know that I'm very keen on the brain-body connection. So obviously psychologically you can work on that, whether it's through therapy, or whether it's through, a program that you do. But I'm a really big believer in somatic work, because particularly suppressed memories or emotions, or just things that were too complex for us to understand as children, can get somatized. Now, there's this phrase, psychosomatic, which had a bad reputation because it implies that whether you've got physical aches and pains or some sort of, actual illness or disease, that if it's psychosomatic, you're making it up because of your mind. But somatization of psychological issues is a fact. We know that now that we can scan brains and bodies, that, the mind, the brain, the body are so intimately connected. And particularly if you don't voice your emotions or write out your emotions or exercise to sweat out the stress hormone cortisol, then that's going to manifest somewhere, right? So whether it's breathing practices, whether it's taking salt baths, whether it's massage, whether it's Tai Chi, or working with a somatic practitioner who helps you to just move your body in a certain way, that can actually release quite a lot of these emotions that might be held in your body. Now, there's a very old book, I'm sure you've heard of it, called The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah, amazing book. For anyone who's listening, it's a long book and it's in depth, but yes, oh my gosh.
So that was actually written, the research was done on PTSD in war veterans mostly. And, it came out in the 70s, but even then, this doctor was aware of the fact that that post-traumatic stress could show up in people's bodies, whether it's their posture, whether it's their alignment of how they walk, whether it's like joint issues, headaches, anything, and actual disease. Now, that book has been back in the bestseller lists recently, which I think is a good sign, because right at the start of the pandemic, I thought this is going to be a huge mental health disaster. And it's definitely had conscious, mental health issues for people, and probably also less conscious ones that are still having consequences now. So the fact that that book's back in the bestseller list tells me that people are working out that their aches and pains or, gut issues that they may have developed from stress are related to what they experienced mentally. So I think that's a good sign, but I'd love to raise awareness of that for people, because if one person listens to this and thinks, oh yeah, actually I have had aches and pains or more bloating since an identified period of stress, then that could really help them.
I love what you just said and bringing that up. And I agree that it is so important that people are just becoming more aware. And I think that's one of the, at least, I don't want to say benefits of the pandemic. And I do have a question about that specifically, but just in terms of, knowledge, we have to take it into our own hands at this point, understanding and learning. And that's why I love podcasts, YouTube videos, because this is all free for people. And then you get to hear someone like you, Tara, who you are so knowledgeable. Now, I do have a question when it comes to what trauma actually is, because we hear this word trauma. And then there's big T trauma, little t trauma, and I'm sure that you can discuss that. But there's a lot of people out there who they're getting sick, they're getting disease or dis-ease, right? Or cancer in the body. And a lot of this is due to, or majority of it, unresolved trauma or emotion. So can you explain what trauma is for those who might think, I don't have trauma? And how do we start to understand how that's, I mean, how it manifests in the body, you already mentioned, but anything that we should know about trauma?
Yeah, really good question. So what I wanted to bring in from what we've already discussed is that any type of trauma, so whether this is a big identifiable event where something has gone wrong in your life, and the common ones that we talk about in childhood psychology is neglect, abandonment, separation from parents, maybe a parent was in hospital or the child was in hospital for some time and didn't get that, constant bonding that we really need to build healthy neural architecture as children. Or like you said, it's all on a spectrum, right? So I would say little t trauma to big T trauma is on a spectrum, and anything that falls between those could be things like being bullied, or experiencing stress as a child. Now, what's also important to know is that a certain amount of stress as a child can actually make you more resilient. So Freudian psychology basically split childhood into certain year groups like 0 to 2, 2 to 5, and said if you have something going wrong in your life in one of those identified periods, ages, then this is what will be wrong with you later in life. It was all negative. Then Erickson came along and created an updated version of psychosocial stages of childhood development, and basically said that if you have a disruption in those stages, then this is the vice and this is the virtue. So this is what could go wrong, and this is what potentially could actually make you stronger and better. And I like that model because it offers a choice, and it's a little bit like how we started out the conversation, which is what people get wrong about manifestation is that if you know that whatever age you were, whatever the severity of the trauma was that you experienced, that absolutely, it's understandable that you could default to then having an inferiority complex or whatever. But if you understand that there is a choice where, so basically disruption from 5 to 7, which is a common one I see with my sort of CE level clients, leads to inferiority or industry. So that means either that you always feel less than, or you become a real hard worker and actually you achieve like high standards in life and work. So if you knew that, then you could say, okay, I can't undo the past. I maybe can't even remember all of it. But particularly if you can identify the age, then you can look at the two choices and you can see what qualities you have from each. So it may be that you do often have imposter syndrome, but actually that you did work really hard at school, you did do well at university, you did get a good job. And again, we would use the same overwriting technique that I mentioned earlier to try to push ourselves more times than not towards the industry than the inferiority, but completely understanding that there might be that voice in your head that sometimes says, I can't believe you got this job. So one day someone's going to work out that you're not really good enough to do this. It's okay to have thoughts like that sometimes, but also to really appreciate what you have achieved.
As you're saying everything, it's actually made me think about my own life and what I've been going through, which is a divorce. And by the time this comes out, this podcast, I will have probably publicly announced it. And speaking about the body keeps score and just about how the trauma itself manifests in the body. And I'll come to something else that you mentioned in just a second. But what I went through at Louise Hayes and was looking at all the different symptoms in my body because I was starting to feel, I literally for 2 months felt dizzy every single day, like as if I was scared to drive because I was so dizzy. I had what the doctors were calling the 40-day cold. And a lot of people have caught it, but nonetheless, it's a cold that just doesn't go away, and it kind of goes away, then comes back, goes away, comes back, which then turns into a cough, which then can turn into bronchitis. So now here I have trauma itself, let's just say, or emotional, unprocessed emotions. So I'm looking up that. Then I had lower back pain, and it was to the point where my lower back pain got to a 9 out of 10 bad. Like in my marriage, I was at a constant like 5, 6 all the time. And it went to it. And finally, I was like, okay, I need to go to urgent care. So go to urgent care. I think there's a time and a place for medicine, for Western medicine. And I try to live by the Eastern philosophy. So I go and I look at all these different things in Louise Hay's. And she doesn't have dizziness. But I was like, okay, Nikki, where do you feel dizzy in your life? And I'm like, all of this, everything. It's so dizzying, especially because I haven't been able to share it publicly. And, I'm dealing with a variety of things. Then it was... And this was interesting when I wrote down the cough. The cough was, you're trying to bark to the world. And I literally said, I feel silenced, which has sort of been the case with what's been going on and why I had to keep this public. And the lower back pain, which I already knew about, but no wonder it got much worse because I'm not just going through a divorce with my husband. I really have had to create boundaries with parents as well, which has been a whole nother fun bag of worms to deal with. But the lower back, your back is all about stability and support. And my lower back, everyone's lower back is related to relationship instability and financial instability. Wow. And all of them, every single one of them tied together with anger and guilt as the things that were every single thing in my body. And a yeast infection, same thing. And it was anger towards the opposite sex. So I just offer that. I don't know if I've ever gone that detailed on this podcast, but I hope that helps someone listening, because that was mind-blowing for me to recognize. And the other thing that I wanted to just share in response to the two models, Freud and Erikson. Yeah. And Erikson is, you look at someone like me who I do have complex PTSD. I've had a very hard I've had a wonderful childhood in many ways. And I've also had to really come to terms with having a fairly challenging childhood in other ways. And just as you were saying, it's been that catch-22, but it's really what I've allowed it to do for me rather than being a victim to my circumstances. It's helped push me to keep doing, like we are here today because of my drive. And I have that drive because I learned to be independent. So I just wanted to give some stories and context behind the science and the research that you're talking about.
Yeah, and thank you so much for doing that, because I think examples really help people. But I, would like to add to that you are obviously very self-aware and have done a lot of work. And a lot of our listeners may be people who are very much at the beginning of that journey. So you shared a picture with me about how emotions show up in the body. And I think I shared the Louise Hay thing with you. I'm a big fan of that. Alchemy of healing. It's the causes of symptoms. Now, those models are created by people who've done their own research. Things may show up for people differently, but, they're useful models to look at. But the self-awareness piece is really, really key. And I think that was the breakthrough for you, right? Was really understanding that those emotions were associated with those symptoms. I can give you a few other examples which are like really scientific about how stress can show up in the body. So one is about 15 years ago, when I stopped being a psychiatrist and started being a coach, I was working with a lot of banks. And there was examples of people dropping dead of heart attacks or just having a heart attack and not dying on trading floors, which was obviously a very stressful time in the financial crisis. And these were people who were, young, otherwise healthy. They didn't have, for example, obviously high blood pressure, high cholesterol or anything like that. But because they were experiencing so much stress and the levels of cortisol were high all the time, it was causing inflammation throughout the body. And, at the really far end of that, potentially a heart attack that could even cause death. There's also research that shows that after someone experiences a bereavement of a loved one, the rates of cancers, particularly breast cancer for women and testicular cancer for men, go up in the 6 to 18 months after that bereavement.
Wow.
So, you know, those are really kind of like hard facts and full-on diseases. And for, you know, the whole range of humans, that could show up as backache, or it could show up as skin is an interesting one, actually. Let me come to that. So I just wanted to give those extreme examples and then say that for each person that's listening to this, it could be showing up in, you know, any number of different ways. And particularly maybe if you know that you have a bit of a weak spot, like that you do tend to get a chest infection when you have a cold, or your lower back does kind of often twinge and kind of cause you some problems, then yeah, kind of honing into that and trying to understand what that might mean for you in terms of how stress may be, you know, pushing that to show up is a great way to start. Now, your skin is obviously the physical boundary of your body, but psychologically it's also the organ of boundary transgressions. So if you feel that you've been taken advantage of financially, physically, emotionally, verbally, whatever it is, then that can really show up on your skin. So whether it's a rash or it's a flare-up of psoriasis or eczema or dermatitis, have you got a story? You look like this is really resonating.
Yeah, I mean, damn it. It's interesting. I do, and not to interrupt you, but I'm laughing because, so in one sense, my skin on my face has never been better, and I'm getting comments of I look brighter and more vital. Like, and I'm going through a divorce right now, and it is not just any divorce; it's a very challenging one, and I've had to keep it very private. And yeah, that's what I'll say for that. So it's very interesting. In one sense, my skin on my face is the best it's ever been. At the same time, I have shingles on my back right now for the second time. Yeah. So I'm in London. I got it a year ago, a month after we got married. And the first month after we got married was horrible. And I kept asking people, like, is this normal? I thought you go in the honeymoon phase. I'm like, we're definitely not there. And so it's interesting because and this is maybe something that we can go into, but why I shared all of the different ailments that I was going through is because and we can maybe transition into a bit more of the intuition and spirituality, but my soul, my higher self, what I call the true self, she's like, no, we got this, sister. She's trusting, like everything's joyful. I'm in the present moment. And then I really had to slow down. And this is where behind the scenes, going through the divorce, I've been also really doing the work, the inner work, because I'm like, if my body has all of these ailments, there's clearly some unresolved shit, trauma, emotions, whatever it is that I'm not processing yet. So it's interesting that you say about the skin, because I have a big flare up. When do I have it? Well, basically 2 months after we started this divorce process, which has not been easy. When did I get it last time? Last time I was in London, 1 month after our marriage, which was a horrible time. So curious to hear your thoughts on this whole situation.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, the skin will definitely show. I mean, that is, you know, that's something like trying to come out through your skin, isn't it? It's also reactivation, which is interesting. So shingles is a reactivation of a virus. And I would be so curious to know, because I've seen where your shingles are, but on the skin there is something called dermatomes, which are the patches of your skin that are served by particular nerves. And I don't know the answer to this, but which dermatome your shingles are on could also be quite interesting.
Do you know though? Like I'm not saying I'm going to like take my clothes off right now, but like, do you know if I show you where it is? Do you know, or you'd have to go look that up?
I'd have to go and look it up. But the first thing I would say is that the right side and the left side is masculine and left side is feminine. So which side is it on?
Left.
Okay. So basically that means it's partly related to your relationship with your mother, potentially, and it's related to your sense of femininity as well. Yeah. So, you know, in a divorce, and I've been divorced too, so I just want to say to you that it takes a long time, and, you know, you get to certain levels of healing, And then you kind of look back and realize that there's a whole other level that you needed to get to.
It's like, I call it the spiritual onion, where it's just like, you keep going layers upon layers upon layers, and you're just like, when does the layers stop? And they don't stop until the day that we exit our bodies and go back home. But it really, I'm like, oh, and you're so spot on. That's essentially, I'm going through a divorce with two people, with my ex, and also, as I said, the boundaries with my mother, because there's very similar patterns and behaviors, which I've realized probably being repeated from childhood are very toxic for me to be in, especially now. And you're correct in that it's, in one sense, I feel very feminine and light and bright and vital. And in another, I've been in survival mode for a year and a half, and I'm in the most survival mode right now.
And it's also about your identity, because, you know, even if you realized quite quickly that the marriage wasn't happy, you were someone's wife. You were a wife. Now you're going to have to, you know, reform your identity as an independent woman. Obviously, there's a level of uncertainty about the future. Will you be someone's wife again? You know, would you not want to? What does that mean about potential motherhood? So, I think there's three things here. There's your relationship with your mother, there's your own identity as a woman, and then there's your future, you know, potentially as a mother as well. And I believe it's on your shoulder blade, right?
Yeah, it's like,
You don't-
no, I'm not going to take my picture, but it's like, yeah, there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, I would say, like, you know, you're shouldering so much.
Oh my God. Mike dropped her. Oh my God. Literally, that was a, can we just take one of these? And that was, so, you know, I have a question actually. You've mentioned in other podcasts before about the hierarchy in business, and especially related then to women. And there was a specific question I wanted to pull up here. Let's see if I can find it very quickly. But it was having to do with, so people feeling drained. So it was that you talk about the hierarchy of people in business, and those lower down on the hierarchy can start feeling drained. And I'll let you explain that. And specifically, I ask about this because I'm very sensitive to energy, and I feel very drained if I'm with people that, well, I just feel very drained by most humans, let's put it that way. But at the same time, if I'm in a room, like you and I could talk all day long, and it will elevate me and feel much better. And so I also know that I can go into a room and command energy. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about, for those listening, because I know I just did a very big question without prefacing it, but kind of tying into where I'm at within my own journey, being a female, sort of an alpha female at that, and trying to balance that masculine, feminine energy.
Yeah. So when I spoke about this before, I specifically spoke about business because there's such an obvious hierarchy in business, but it actually applies to life. And it comes from an evolutionary mechanism, which is that in groups of people, but actually the research was done on troops of gorillas, how stress is shared in that troop. So the silverback gorilla is the alpha, obviously, and his stress levels affect all the beta males and the female gorillas more than their stress levels affect him or each other. And it was the same when we were in the cave. There was an alpha male, and they would go out hunting in groups, and reacting to the stress level of the alpha male was important as a group. To, like, you know, 4 or 5 men could bring down a woolly mammoth, but they couldn't even speak, so they could grunt and gesture. But if they were aligned, almost like a wolf pack, you know, in terms of like when he's ready to like take that challenge and start, you know, throwing spears or whatever that he's going to do, they've all got to be aligned with that. So that's how it works. And so, you know, in business, basically the CEO and the CFO are usually, it's their stress levels that will affect everyone. But in general life, I think what you're talking about is when you spend time with someone in a room and you can't really necessarily work out why, but you leave just feeling so drained and negative and exhausted. And it might be obvious because that person is telling you something negative, but it may also be that they're suppressing their stress, not actually telling you that something bad's going on or telling you, you know, something bad news for you. but you felt it on that cortisol level because they would have high levels of cortisol. And if you're close enough to someone, then because that comes out through our sweat, it would particles of it would go through your skin and raise your cortisol levels. That's what's making you feel stressed. It's not just a psychological thing, it's a physical thing.
So is stress contagious then?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's in the same way, and I think, you mentioned for women as well, it's in the same way that menstrual synchronization occurs. And again, the evolutionary reason for that was that when we lived in the cave, there was a very high risk of miscarriage or stillbirth or a baby dying of hypothermia or being eaten by a predator. So for the alpha male to ensure that his genes would be passed on, he had to impregnate 4 or 5 women at the same time, especially if he was leaving the cave to go hunting. Sometimes they would leave for months, sometimes they would never come back. So that's because certain what we call steroid hormones, and here I'm talking about the sex steroid hormones, they leak out of your skin and affect women around you. And so what would be interesting is if you lived with a group of women, as you are most likely the alpha woman in that group, everyone else's periods would synchronize to yours.
Really?
Yeah. I remember being on a yoga retreat and basically it was all women. And some women saying, oh, my period came early, or some women saying like, I was expecting mine, but it hasn't happened yet. And mine was on time. So I was like, oh, I must be the alpha woman in this group.
Because I've heard of, I think every woman knows this, is that you sync with roommates or in work. But that's fascinating that you sync to the more alpha female of that. But I could also see that, and this is obviously not research backed at all. This is a personal opinion. But I can see that being the case because there is something about an alpha female which does make other females feel safe in a sense. Like I know that I hold a lot of space for the women in my community, in my programs. Like I got your back. And there's not a lot of women that I feel that same thing with. So that makes sense. That's again, my non-scientific approach here. So in terms of neuroscience and spirituality, what do we need to know?
So you already mentioned that you think there's a time and place for Western medicine, but you practice Eastern philosophies. And so with the example that I gave you of overwriting a negative thought with a positive affirmation, that the Buddhists knew that, millennia ago. There's actually a Buddhist saying which is replace every negative thought with a positive thought. And now the science has caught up. Since we understand about neuroplasticity, which is sort of 20, 30 years now, we understand that, your brain can change even in adulthood, and that one of the things you can do is cultivate a more positive mindset. And we can see, neural pathways changing, whether it's your mindset, whether it's learning a language or, improving your tennis. That when we change something in our life, when we learn something, we see that the brain is very dynamic and moldable and shapeable. But it's incredible to me that, there are so many ancient spiritual practices that are now becoming proven by science. I mean, my own personal example that I just laugh about now is, so my mother brought us up with a kind of Ayurvedic diet, and she used to say things like turmeric, can prevent Alzheimer's and bowel cancer, and we used to just like fall off our chairs laughing. And then it was actually when I was at medical school that the research came out about curcumin, which is the active ingredient in turmeric. And, I sort of thought, I've got to go home and tell my mum this. And that was kind of an early one. But then sort of after medical school, I really got into yoga. And that's when my family's, belief system kind of started mixing for me with the Western medicine that I'd learnt and was practicing at the time. And it just became less that they were two completely separate things, and they just naturally started to become more overlapping. And I think for me, when I was writing The Source, which is obviously about manifestation and visualization, but I was putting cognitive science behind it, the first thing I did before I started writing, over the summer holidays, I did some research into, can psychology and neuroscience explain the laws of attraction? So I had to look up what those laws actually were, what they were claiming, and think, could I explain this in terms of like how you think and how your brain works? And it was sort of like 10 out of 12 of them. It was just so obvious to me how it was working in the brain. So that was quite, that was like a step change for me in thinking, okay, these things can really go together. Then I wrote the book and obviously did a lot more research, and it made sense to me logically. But it was actually the response from people that really landed it for me, that it is okay to have spirituality and science in your life. And I would say the journey since then is only more that these things are coming together. And in season 2 of my podcast, I have been applying ancient wisdom to modern mental health struggles. And I have spoken to people who talk about Sufism, Kabbalah, Christianity, people who work on the border of life and death, so, about expanding your consciousness. Talked about neuroaesthetics, which is the importance of nature and beauty and creativity in your life. So it just made me realize that all the things that we need for our mental health, our health, and these things all contribute to longevity as well. They've been around since we've been humans. We've just forgotten. So it's really, I think, a process of re-looking at some of those spiritual practices. If you need to, then seeing if there's science that backs that up, and just incorporating wider ways of thinking into, your psyche, basically.
I love that you also just touched on your story a little bit, which I did want to go in there. You shared so much just now, and I'm curious when it comes to, everything that you've just spoken about and that intersection. When we think about our own intuition, right? I see your eyes just lit up. When we think about our own intuition, most people on this planet say, why am I here? What's my purpose? How do I follow my gut? I don't even know, I'm so out of tune with myself. I've never been in tune with myself. So what do you want to share with people when it comes to intuition and following your body or your mind's intuition, or the science behind it even?
I'm a huge fan of intuition. I literally live my life with my intuition. And looking back, I was always intuitive, but I, probably as a young adult or a child, I didn't really know what it was. And no one teaches you to trust your gut, do they? Everything, well, certainly, when I was at school and university, was very much about logical learning. I think when I was a junior doctor, one of my seniors said to me, "You've got really good judgment." And I just had a sense that doesn't always come from the knowing mind and the facts and the data. It comes from having seen patterns and recognizing them. And, even everything you learn at medical school, you don't remember it all consciously all the time. And certainly you don't remember everything you've experienced in your whole life, but you pick up life lessons. And there's so much I could say here. I don't know what order to say it in, but I'll get it all there. So there's something called Hebbian learning, which is named after the neuroscientist Donald Hebb. That's essentially that phrase, neurons that fire together, wire together. And so the longer ago that something was, or the not so obvious that it was, you've still experienced it, and it's still been, wired into your neurons, but it tends to get pushed deeper, and that's where it's what we call, more subconscious or non-conscious. So in the outer cortex of the brain, which is more planning and predicting and logic, we hold, the information and memories that we need to live our daily life. The intuition and emotion are deeper in the limbic system of the brain. And that's the deep part of the brain that's the size of your clenched fist, and then you have your cortex around it. And there's a huge neuronal connection between the limbic system and the gut. So we believe that even less conscious material is stored in the brainstem, the spinal cord, and the gut neurons. And that's why intuition is also known as gut instinct. So basically, the main reason that people don't know whether to trust it or not is that for the longest time, until very recently really, we didn't believe that it was actually a thing. Again, it's only since we've been able to scan brains and understand about the different systems in the brain and the connection with the gut that we've really understood that intuition is another form of data, just like logic, just like emotion, just like motivation, that not only can we access it, but we can also hone it. For me, journaling was the way that I honed my intuition. And I literally started off by thinking, I'd be in a certain place and need to make a decision. And if logic and intuition are aligned, then there's no issue, is there? But it was when they weren't. And the best examples I have of this, and it'd be interesting to hear what you say about this, is when you've got a friend that you can see that the relationship that they're in is not good for them and it's breaking down and it's probably going to end, but they are clinging on and trying to make it last. They're super unhappy, but they just want to stay in the relationship and they don't want to have a breakup or be single, and they feel like they're never going to meet anyone again. What often happens in retrospect is that friends will say, I knew that it wasn't going to last and I should have left earlier, but at the time, because there's so much emotion going on, it all just gets blurred and scary, and you don't listen to your inner voice. So if you can write down an example of a conflict there between your logic and your intuition, and in the lowest risk version of that, go with your intuition instead of your logic, if you would normally go with your logic, and just see what happens and write it down and just prove to yourself whether that is a voice that you can really trust, and then build up. And, obviously, like I've said, preferably they're aligned. But if they're not, see if you can take the risk, with a bigger thing next time, and just give yourself permission for that to be another way for you to think.
Would intuition be considered the same as being in presence?
So you said something earlier that I really loved, which is that when you were doing your inner work, you were, thinking with your head and your heart. I take that one step further and say head, heart, and gut. So that's basically your logic, your emotions, and your intuition being aligned. What exactly was the phrase that you used about intuition?
I was just, as you were talking about it, it kind of made me think of being in the present, right? Because in intuition, like when I think about, and this is so random, and I've never shared, I don't know if I've ever shared this with anyone before, and it's such a sort of silly thing, but when I was in elementary school, which is around I want to say 10 or 11, 5th grade, I could always tell did you ever see the movie Mean Girls?
I don't think so.
There's a part in which one of the girls, there's something in her body and she's like, I think it's going to be bad weather, but it's kind of a joke.
Okay, yeah.
But my collarbones would start to really hurt. And I could always tell that a big storm was coming in like a day or two before. So I've always been very tuned in. I then got disconnected from myself. And just as you were saying, the word or the phrase intuition to presence and the intersection of those just came into my mind, because when I think about going through my eating disorders, body dysmorphia, depression, anxiety, insomnia so I was insomniac for 6 or 7 years. I was on Ambien for 5 years of that. I had doctors just try and put me on antidepressants to come off of the Ambien. And I was like, no. So through all of that, obviously I got disconnected from myself. And so when I think about intuition, you do have to have a connection to yourself, but we're dimming our own connection to ourself and a higher source of whatever you believe in through an abundance of not just, the external things, the drinking, the pharmaceutical drugs or shopping addictions, over-exercising, isolating. Yeah. So I was just thinking then in terms of the present, my intuition at least comes when I'm in the present moment because I'm more silent. So I'm not someone who goes and meditates every day. My everyday life is sort of a meditation. And so I'm like, that's presence, and that's where intuition comes. So I was just wondering if that.
I mean, I think that word means a lot to you, and I know that because you've used it before with me. For me, I would use the word alignment, but I think we're basically saying exactly the same thing. And I agree, you do have to be in touch with your body to access that voice. I love that quote from Rumi, there's a voice that doesn't use words, listen. That to me embodies the feeling of when I experience my intuition. So yeah, being connected to your physical body. And I'm glad you raised the point that actually having your gut physically in good condition aligns with that. Because if you're bloated or you've got poor digestion, that's when you feel clouded in terms of your intuition. So all the things that are good for your body generally are good for your gut. So basically eat right. And some of the more things than what you mentioned are stress, antibiotics, processed food. They all can impact your gut microbiome. And, sleep enough, drink enough water. Physical exercise also improves your gut microbiome, and managing your stress, obviously. And just like you, I actually stopped meditating during the pandemic because I decided that I wanted my whole life to be mindful. And if you meditate, let's say for half an hour a day, then you're super mindful for half an hour and you're not for 23 and a half hours. And I'm not saying that 100% of my day is mindful, but I try to have as many mindful moments throughout the day as I can, whether that's mindful eating, mindful cooking, mindful walking. And attention is a really important one. So I don't know if you know Professor Amishi Jha. She does her research on attention and mindfulness. And I interviewed her for my MIT online program. And we were just chatting ahead of the interview. And then, when we were ready to start and I was going to ask the first question, her entire demeanor changed. And she was just like 100% present. And I remember thinking, wow, if that's what research on attention does for you, I would like a piece of that, please. So I think your version of that is presence. My version of that is alignment. And for everybody that's listening, they'll probably have a different word for it. But it's about getting to that point of understanding that intuition is a real thing. It's as valid as logic. And it's the potential that you have within yourself to access that is huge.
Something that I have clients do, so I've shared it with you, but I have the Dream Binder, and those who have listened to my podcast before know about this. It's from my program, the Ultimate Transformation Program. And in that, what I have clients do is court evidence 1, court evidence 2, and court evidence 3. And I call it court evidence. And there's a reason I'm telling this story, because court evidence 3 essentially is tapping into, in a different way, your intuition, because we all have the fear of, if I quit my job, if I leave my relationship, if I move to a new state, new city, oh my God, what then? I'm going to fail. I won't meet someone new. I won't make more money. And so I have people write down all of the evidence, hence the court evidence, as to why that's not true. So now we're telling the ego mind, no. So ego mind gets a chance in court evidence 1 to write down all the fears that happen. Like, oh my God, if I break up, if I lose all my money, what will happen then? So that's court evidence 1. That's your ego mind. And then court evidence 3 is from your higher self, your true self, coming in, or from your heart even, or your solar plexus, your gut, and really giving reasons as to why that's not true. And so that's, I think there's so many teaching something similar, same, but different.
Yeah.
And
what's court evidence 2?
Court evidence 2 is a fun one. So that's actually where you rewrite the story of your childhood, and you go and search back for and bring to memory, into conscious memory with very specific questions. What were the good memories that you had? What were some of the lessons that you learned? Because so many people I've seen who suffer or have challenges in today, those who join the program, majority of them say, I had a messed up childhood. My parents did this to me. And so we're changing the narrative to say, no, they didn't do this to you. it happened, but let's call to mind all the good things that also happened, just as you were talking about with at the very beginning of manifestation, of changing the negative into the positive. And so now I realize that I'm having people do that just in a slightly different way. And then there's one that we do, it's called What Then? So you take the fear and you literally keep going of like, okay, what then if you get divorced? Okay, what will happen then? I don't know. I won't have anywhere to live. Okay, well, what then? I don't have anywhere to live. Okay, I'll be on the streets. Okay, what then? And you keep going down to, and you recognize that the fear itself is tied to something that is either I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, or it has something to do with you're afraid of becoming your parents, which is really fascinating. Oh, wow, yeah.
They're all really great exercises.
What I would love to do is, because we were talking about stress, and something that I find, and I'm really curious about the science behind this, or even the manifestations of, can we manifest bad things into our life because of our subconscious or our nervous system?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really important point about neuroplasticity. I mostly love to say neuroplasticity is hope and potential, but neuroplasticity can, it's anything that you repeat and that has emotional intensity will get embedded into your brain more. So obsessing over a breakup, you can imagine that all that's going to do is give you evidence that you should never, get into a relationship and give someone your heart again because they'll break it. And so what the brain does, and this is a safety mechanism, is that when you're about to take one of those risks, like you said, leave your job, leave your relationship, move countries or whatever, the amygdala and the hippocampus, so the amygdala is where the emotions arise from and the hippocampus is where we store memories, they will get together and bring up every negative memory of anything like that you've done before. So it will be, well, remember the last time you went through a breakup? Remember when you asked your boss for a raise and he said no? Think of that poor girl that moved to, America and then her life.
Why does it do? I mean, I'm assuming this happens in a split second on its own. Do we know why that happens?
Yes, because anything new or uncertainty is the biggest threat to the brain. So the brain will always try to keep you in the safest possible place. And so for the brain, when it's working in that primitive way, which it does more when we're under stress, you taking any risk is not safe. So it will try to prevent you from taking risks. And that's when you really have to get the strength from all of those sorts of exercises to override that and say, there is a step that I can take that is a healthy risk that could actually lead to a much better life. And the other explanation I love for that is we've talked a lot about cortisol and stress, and they correlate with emotions like fear, anger, shame, disgust, sadness. So, and disgust is a really important one because if we didn't experience disgust for food that was kind of, turning bad when we lived in the cave, we could have died off as a species. So it's quite inbuilt. And all of those things that you've mentioned, like never having a relationship again, running out of money, being a failure, they're all associated with shame, self-disgust and shame. But when you choose to take a healthy risk, you do everything that you can, whether it's the psychological work, whether it's somatic work, whether it's, asking yourself, is that actually a fact? And you move your brain from the cortisol state to the oxytocin state, which is the state of love and trust and joy and excitement. And I know that some of those are some of your favorite words. When you're operating on that basis, you've got resources flowing around your brain, in the blood supply, and you're much more likely to take a healthy risk, trust, see the positive side, potential of things. So in terms of the nervous system, yes, it can do that to you. But also, if you can do as many of the things as you can to keep your nervous system in the, rest and rejuvenate and love and trust state, then you're more likely to grasp the opportunities that could lead you towards the things that you want. And so that's manifesting. And if you're unable to do that for periods of your life, and examples of that are, divorce or work stress or an adjustment to living in a different country. When you're in that state, it is harder to do those things, but there's two ways to look at it. One is that you can build in practices now that keep you more resilient. Or when you're in a difficult place, you can start those practices. The science shows that it still helps. So, Amishi Jar's work was with the US Marines, and some practice mindfulness for months before, being deployed into a war zone, and some didn't, but then they started when they got there, and they also had benefits. So, it's never too late, but it is about doing as many small things as you can. So rather than one big thing, small things like what I've mentioned, having salt baths, meditating, or, bringing mindfulness moments into your life, sleeping and waking at regular times, having good people around you. All of those things can set you up more. And, yesterday when we were texting, I said, you're incredibly beautiful. Now, you're obviously incredibly beautiful, but I said it because I thought maybe she's not feeling that way right now. And so I just want to say that because I know it will make her feel good. And, I've also got two friends who I've mentioned to you, the two that are coming round tomorrow, who just out of the blue sent me, they don't know each other, just separately, sent me like a really, really loving message. And I was like, oh, thank you so much. That's just such a gift. It makes you always feel good. And I found out with both of them that they were going through a really tough time. But their choice at that time was to reach out to someone with love. And I've learned that from them. I do that more now because I saw them do it to me. It's because it's just so easy when you're feeling low or stressed to not turn to love and focus on the negative thoughts. So again, that's another neuroplasticity journey that, this is why I do podcasts, because I would love more people to feel that they have that choice.
Everything you just said, it's so fascinating for me. You just named multiple different exercises that we do in my program in the Dream Binder. And I want to just share this with the audience that whether or not, someone joins my program or not, you can still go and create this. So I have clients do what I call the self-love list. And so it's writing down when you're in a good moment, when you're feeling good and you're like, oh, I like having tea, right? Or I like doing warm lemon water. I like going for a walk. I like Soul Cycle, whatever it is. And then on the right-hand column, I have you write down kind of the affirmations of like, I believe in myself. I can do this. So that when you're in those bad moments, you look at the list, and this list has been a life savior to me in years past. Like, it's so ingrained in my brain now that I don't need, like, I could list everything on my list for you. But there was a time where I needed to look at this every single day and literally be like, okay, Nikki, put one foot in front of the other and go do the thing. Take a shower, wash your hair, blow dry your hair. That makes you feel good. And then I also, most people have heard of the 5 love languages. So I have the 5 love languages cheat sheet, where you then write down what are all of the ways in which things you would like to receive from a partner, only now you're going to start doing those for yourself and being really specific of not just, I want love notes. It's like, what do I want to hear? Because we all have certain things that we feel the weakest about. Whether it's we feel weak in asking or receiving help. We feel weak when it comes to, like, my Achilles heel really is about business. I always feel like I'm not doing enough. Why am I not more? Versus if you tell me I'm pretty, it's like, well, thank you so much. If you tell me, God, your podcast is amazing, I'm like, oh my God, thank you, right? So then you do that actually for yourself, and it's the simple, small things that you're saying. So I tell clients is set yourself up for success with stupid, simple goals. And it's as simple as that. And the other thing that you mentioned too is just about service. And that's something that I learned during my second book that I was writing. I was incredibly stressed out, the marketing of it. And it was like I'd heard this of writing the book is the hardest thing you'll do. Editing the book, it's like, no, the editing is the worst.
It's the worst.
And then you get to the marketing and you're like, no, the marketing is the worst of it. And I've done 2 books now and I'm like, oh my goodness. So the second one, I realized that I was really stressed out. And at that time I had a friend who, her grandmother, who was very much the matriarch of the family, was dying. And I had another best friend who her mother was diagnosed once again with, this time with stage 4 brain cancer. And in those moments, I remember taking a step back and being like, you're publishing a book, Nikki, and your stress is nothing compared to these two ladies. And so I would write to them almost on a daily basis and just say, how are you doing? I'm checking in, sending you love. And they would try and turn the conversation around. I was like, I'm here fully to be of service to you. And honestly, it has completely transformed my life. Like the more stress, and during my divorce and all of this, I honestly think part of the reason that I've been able to manage it so elegantly and great, I actually called it Operation Graceful Divorce. But I think the reason that I've been able to do that is because I have been so of service to other people, to friends, to clients, and also receiving help as it comes. And so I love that you touch on also the science behind it of why this works.
That actually made me feel so emotional. It's so beautiful. Yeah, like, you know, I think you're a complete angel. And when I said you were beautiful, I meant inside and out. So I have actually a very similar story. And what I was thinking, listening to you, is we have obviously had very different life experiences and we come from completely different backgrounds. But it's incredible to me how we've kind of come to the same solutions. And we've also emotionally had similar journeys, which makes me think that that's probably going to resonate with a lot of people that are listening. So when I was getting divorced, I wrote in my journal things to do when you're feeling down, because I literally in the down moments could not think of any of them. And they were things like take a bath, call a friend, eat a square of chocolate, read a magazine. It's simple things. But there were times when my brain was so stressed that I couldn't, I'd sit there and think, oh, I feel terrible. And I wouldn't be able to think of one solution for what to do about that. And just like you, I got to the point where after going and looking at the list several times, I got to the point where I didn't have to look at the list anymore. And I knew, okay, I'm not feeling great. Let's get a square of chocolate or whatever it is. And obviously I've spoken about this widely, 10 things I'm grateful for in my journal if I'm at home. But sometimes I'm out on the street and I'm like, I'm not really having a great day. What can I do? Oh, I'll give gratitude. So in my mind, I'll just think of 10 things I'm grateful for. But in my sort of the biggest relationships in my life, we used to write to each other 10 things I love about you. And so then I started doing it with my girlfriends who were single because they didn't have, that. And then they would start doing it back to me. And it's just so interesting to see what people say about you. And it's really lovely.
I am honestly, Tara, I am like mind blown right now that we do the same things. And I really love that you call it that, like what to do when I'm not feeling good or feeling down. Like I might have to rename mine for clients, but it really goes to show that the work that I'm doing, as you said, like we come from completely different backgrounds, different stories, different contexts. And this is why I think it's so phenomenal. That doesn't matter. Our stories are so important, but holding on to them for the resistance are not important. It's where they guide us. And it's so interesting. Like going back to intuition, I had asked, I literally just blindly reached out to you on Instagram and said, would you come on my podcast? And a few weeks later, you wrote to me and said, I had no idea who you were. I just felt called to. So like talk about intuition and kind of piecing everything together here. It really is mind-blowing for me.
Yeah, because at that time I didn't know as much about how aligned our values were, but I just had a good feeling about you. And I think I also said that, I don't say yes to everybody that asks me because I don't have time. So yeah, that was such good intuition on my part. I'm very pleased with myself.
I'm very pleased too.
So I wanted to just to wrap up, bring a bit more science into some of the things that we talked about, because you mentioned service and I mentioned gratitude. So the research now on how good gratitude is for your brain is it's massive. I don't even really need to talk about that one because that's become very, very accepted. But more recently, and this actually came from my neuroaesthetics research, shows that service and volunteering also promote your own mental health and longevity. And then there's another thing that kind of wraps around that, which is having a purpose that transcends yourself. So, you do your job for a reason, you earn money for it. It may be, even if it's in the caring profession, it's still a job that you're earning money for. But having some motivation in life that doesn't advantage you, but is of service, to the world, that actually does advantage you in a way. So it's a great thing to do. Basically altruism is very good for your brain and your body. So that those were the main things I wanted to bring in: purpose, service, gratitude, volunteering. These are also things that people can try to bring into their toolkit that may not be obvious at first, but are actually, contributing to your own mental health and confidence. And I guess the other thing I wanted to say, because this came up a few times between us, is that people are always moving on to the next thing. And so it's always about what you haven't got yet or what you haven't achieved yet. It's very rare for people to step back and say, like one of your exercises, these are all the things that I've done. These are the things I'm proud of. These were the golden moments in my life. I'd love to think that maybe people would take the time, if they've got a weekend or some downtime, to write that down, just so that you can look at it again, like the things to do when I'm not feeling good.
And everything that, you and I both mentioned here are free. And I see there's so much resistance that people have to changing their life, because it's like, you think about biohacking and the longevity studies and protocols to follow. And it's like, I know that people get scared off because it's like, I need money to have good skin. It's like, well, yes, a facial is a good thing to do. And there's so many free things to do that we've talked about. Every single episode I tell the audience, please have a piece of pen and paper ready, ready, because there's going to be exercises, there's going to be things you want to write down, aha moments. And so I acknowledge you for sharing so many similar things and ideas, and just reiterating that being of service actually helps longevity and helps your confidence. So where can people find you?
I'm most active on Instagram, where you found me, Dr. Tara Swart. And I'm also on Twitter and LinkedIn, but not as much. And my website is taraswart.com. And my podcast is Reinvent Yourself with Dr. Tara.
Beautiful. And one last question for you, Tara, is what are your 3 tips for someone to live a sharper life?
Okay. I'm going to make them general themes because there's so many, individual tips, but I think we've touched on them. So the first one that I say to a lot of people is try to do all the good things that we've mentioned, like sleep, diet, hydration, exercise, and mindfulness, but don't stress about them, because it's the stress that will actually kill you. So stress management, just, doing things that you enjoy, bringing like small changes into your life. That's my kind of big one. Then I've got to say one about neuroplasticity. So learning something new doesn't just give you the benefits of learning, let's say, a language. It gives you global benefits in your brain. It makes you more able to regulate your emotion, not default to your biases, think outside the box. So I would encourage people to take on a new learning at any age. And the third one that I think really came through today, which we couldn't have planned, is, living your life motivated by love, having your brain in the state of love, embodying love, sending love out to people. It's good for you, and it's good for all the people around you. So, and it's a brain state. So it's helpful for all of that trust and manifesting.
Beautiful. And of course, now I want to go on a tangent all about what you were saying of stress and how that kills us more than anything, but I'm not going to. We will save that for part 2. Dr. Tara Swart, thank you so much for saying yes, your intuition, saying yes, coming on. And I just want to say thank you once again. Thank you to the listeners. If you are watching this on YouTube, thank you. If you found value in this podcast episode, please give it a rating, a 5-star. Please share what you enjoyed. Don't forget to share the clips of this on social media, tagging both of us. We will repost it, share your favorite moments. And if you found value, share it with someone else, because I think we can all do with a little bit more love, service, presence, intuition in our life, and understanding how to manifest things. And until next week, here's to a sharper life.